INFJs, introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging, are often described as empathetic, insightful, and compassionate individuals. However, even INFJs can exhibit toxic behavior, especially when their emotions are out of balance or when they are in unhealthy situations. Toxic INFJs may manipulate others, use their empathy as a weapon, or push people away while creating emotional chaos. If you find yourself dealing with a toxic INFJ, it's essential to set boundaries and approach them with psychological strategies that encourage healthy behavior rather than feed into their negative patterns. Here are 10 psychological tricks to deal with a toxic INFJ effectively and, in some cases, help them see the impact of their behavior. Toxic INFJs can push limits, often testing how far they can go emotionally. One of the best ways to handle them is to set clear, firm boundaries. Establish what behaviors you will and will not tolerate and stick to these limits. INFJs, especially toxic ones, often respect firmness and clarity because it prevents emotional manipulation. Psychological trick: reiterate your boundaries calmly but assertively. They may try to push you, but consistency will force them to acknowledge your limits. One of the key traits of a toxic INFJ is their ability to use emotions as leverage. INFJs are naturally skilled at reading emotions, and when they fall into toxic behavior patterns, they can exploit this skill to manipulate those around them. Toxic INFJs may provoke emotional responses in others, such as anger, frustration, or guilt, in order to gain control of a situation or to shift the focus away from their own actions. They might play the victim, exaggerate their feelings, or become passive-aggressive, all in an attempt to get you to react emotionally. When you respond emotionally, you inadvertently feed into their toxic cycle. They may interpret your emotional response as validation of their behavior or use it as an opportunity to twist the narrative in their favor. For example, if you respond with anger or defensiveness, a toxic INFJ might flip the script and accuse you of being the one at fault, all while positioning themselves as the misunderstood victim. This emotional back and forth can quickly spiral into a toxic dynamic where the INFJ thrives on the emotional chaos they've created. Remaining calm and composed in the face of toxic behavior is a powerful psychological tool because it disrupts the INFJ's emotional manipulation. If the toxic INFJ cannot elicit the emotional response they're seeking, they lose the ability to control the situation. When you stay emotionally neutral, it forces them to confront their own behavior without the distraction of your emotional reaction. This makes it much harder for them to shift blame or manipulate the narrative in their favor. In addition, keeping your emotions in check protects your own mental health. Emotional engagement with a toxic person can be draining and leave you feeling exhausted, confused, or guilty. By staying calm, you not only maintain control of the interaction but also preserve your own emotional energy. This can prevent you from becoming overly entangled in their toxic web and give you the clarity needed to handle the situation more effectively. Here are a few strategies to help you maintain emotional neutrality when dealing with a toxic INFJ. Pause before reacting. When a toxic INFJ says or does something that triggers an emotional response, take a moment to pause before reacting. This brief pause allows you to process what's happening and choose a calm, measured response instead of reacting impulsively. Focus on facts, not feelings. When interacting with a toxic INFJ, try to steer the conversation toward objective facts rather than emotional arguments. This prevents them from derailing the conversation with emotional manipulation and forces them to address the issue at hand. Practice emotional detachment. Emotional detachment doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you're able to separate your emotions from the situation so that they don't control you. Detachment allows you to observe the toxic behavior without being sucked into it emotionally. Use non-confrontational language when responding to a toxic INFJ. Choose language that is calm and non-confrontational. Avoid accusatory phrases like "you always" or "you never," as these can escalate the situation. Instead, use neutral statements such as "I noticed that," or "it seems like." Don't take the bait. Toxic INFJs may try to provoke you by pushing your buttons or bringing up sensitive topics. Recognize when they're baiting you and refuse to engage with those triggers. Simply say, "I'm not going to discuss this right now," and move on. By avoiding emotional reactions, you take away the toxic INFJ's power to manipulate the situation. This strategy not only keeps you in control but also forces the INFJ to confront their behavior without the distraction of emotional chaos. In many cases, your calm, unshakable demeanor can prompt the INFJ to reflect on their actions and consider the impact of their toxic behavior. Imagine you're having a conversation with a toxic INFJ who's trying to guilt trip you by saying something like, "I guess I'm just a terrible person, and you don't care about me at all." Instead of reacting emotionally and rushing to reassure them or defend yourself, you respond calmly, I don't think this conversation is productive right now. Let's revisit it when we can both talk more openly. By not engaging emotionally, you prevent the INFJ from manipulating the situation and stop their toxic behavior in its tracks. In summary, avoiding emotional reactions is a key tool in dealing with a toxic INFJ. It helps you stay grounded, prevents emotional manipulation, and forces the INFJ to confront their own actions without the cover of emotional distraction. This psychological strategy can greatly reduce the power dynamic that toxic individuals often rely on to control their relationships. 3. Use empathy against them. Ironically, INFJs are highly empathetic but can weaponize empathy to guilt trip or manipulate others. When they are toxic, turning their empathy back on them can be a powerful tool. Ask them to imagine how their actions would make others feel, forcing them to confront the emotional impact of their behavior. Psychological trick: frame your concerns in a way that appeals to their empathy, such as, I wonder how you would feel if someone did that to you? This can snap them out of their toxic tendencies, even if only temporarily. One effective psychological technique for dealing with a toxic INFJ is to mirror their behavior. Toxic INFJs, like many manipulators, tend to use subtle, covert tactics to control others, whether through passive aggression, guilt tripping, or emotional manipulation. By reflecting their behavior back at them, you can disrupt their strategies and force them to confront their own actions. When you mirror someone's behavior, you subtly adopt their communication style, body language, or tone of voice, essentially holding up a metaphorical mirror to their actions. This technique can be particularly disarming for toxic individuals, as it compels them to see how they're acting and the effects of their behavior. Why mirroring works: toxic INFJs often thrive on being in control, subtly steering conversations and emotions to maintain an upper hand. They tend to use indirect communication, making it hard to directly challenge their behavior. However, when you mirror their behavior, you're showing them, without overt confrontation, how they are acting. This can make them uncomfortable, as they are suddenly faced with a version of their own manipulative tactics. For example, if a toxic INFJ is being passive-aggressive, you might respond with similarly indirect statements. If they're using guilt to manipulate you, gently mirroring that guilt can highlight the manipulation for what it is. This is a way to expose their tactics without escalating the situation into a direct conflict. By reflecting their behavior back at them, you essentially take away their power to manipulate, because they are now seeing their own actions from an outside perspective. In some cases, toxic individuals may become flustered or unsettled when their tactics are mirrored, leading them to back down or rethink their approach. Here are a few strategies to mirror a toxic INFJ's behavior in a way that disrupts their manipulation while maintaining control of the situation. If a toxic INFJ uses emotionally manipulative language, reflect it back at them in a similar tone. For example, if they say something like, I guess you don't care about me anymore, you could respond with, I guess I'm just not sure how much you care about me either. This makes them face the emotional manipulation they're using. If the toxic INFJ is using nonverbal cues, like crossing their arms, rolling their eyes, or sighing heavily, you can mirror their body language subtly. By mimicking these actions, you can make them aware of how their nonverbal communication is affecting the situation without verbally confronting them. When the toxic INFJ speaks in a particular tone, for example, condescending or overly sweet in a passive-aggressive way, you can reflect that tone back at them. Similarly, match their speaking pace. If they're talking slowly to emphasize a point, slow down your speech as well. This forces them to hear their tone and realize how it's coming across. Toxic INFJs often project their emotions onto others. If they are guilt-tripping or playing the victim, respond with a similar emotional tone, but direct it toward them. For example, if they say, I'm always the one who gets blamed for everything, you can respond with, it feels like I'm also getting blamed unfairly. This shows them the manipulation in real time. The key to mirroring is to remain emotionally detached. You're not engaging emotionally with their toxic behavior, you're simply reflecting it back. By staying calm and composed, you're reinforcing the mirror effect without letting their tactics pull you into an emotional confrontation. Toxic INFJs often rely on their ability to subtly manipulate emotions while avoiding direct confrontation. They may play the role of the misunderstood victim or the emotionally sensitive one who just cares too much. By mirroring their behavior, you break the emotional manipulation loop without needing to call them out directly, which is something they might be able to deflect or twist in their favor. When you mirror, it becomes much harder for them to maintain their manipulative stance because they're seeing themselves reflected in your actions. This can lead them to recognize the toxic nature of their behavior or, at the very least, make them uncomfortable enough to stop. Even if they don't fully change their ways, mirroring puts the focus back on their behavior, creating a situation where they're forced to rethink their approach. Imagine you're having a discussion with a toxic INFJ who frequently uses passive-aggressive comments to manipulate you. If they say something like, "I guess I'm just not important to you anymore," instead of defending yourself emotionally, you could mirror that comment back with, "I was thinking the same thing, sometimes it feels like I'm not that important either." This tactic takes the emotional sting out of their manipulation and forces them to recognize how their words sound. It's a subtle, non-aggressive way to point out their behavior without escalating the situation into a direct argument. While mirroring can be highly effective, it's important to use this strategy carefully. It's not about mocking or mimicking the toxic INFJ in a way that feels disrespectful or antagonizing. Instead, it's about gently reflecting their behavior back to them in a way that makes them see their actions more clearly. When their actions don't align with these ideals, it creates cognitive dissonance, a mental discomfort caused by holding two conflicting beliefs or behaving in ways that don't match their self-image. By bringing their contradictions to light, you can expose this dissonance and force them to either justify or correct their behavior. Here are some practical tips for doing this. For instance, if they're preaching about fairness but acting unjustly, you could say, "I know fairness is really important to you. Do you think what happened earlier aligns with that value?" This can create a significant amount of cognitive dissonance, making it harder for them to maintain their toxic behavior without confronting their inconsistencies. Moreover, INFJs are naturally introspective, and even the toxic ones tend to reflect deeply on their actions, especially when presented with evidence of hypocrisy. By calmly presenting them with contradictions in their words and actions, you're inviting them to engage in the kind of self-reflection that INFJs typically value. This can lead to a more genuine confrontation with their behavior and potentially inspire change. Imagine you're dealing with a toxic INFJ who frequently plays the victim, claiming that they are always misunderstood and mistreated by others. However, you notice that they often act in ways that cause confusion or hurt in their relationships. If they complain about how others treat them, you could say, "You've mentioned feeling misunderstood a lot, but I've also noticed that you don't always explain how you're feeling. Do you think that could be why people struggle to understand you?" This forces them to consider whether their own actions might be contributing to their issues, rather than allowing them to continue seeing themselves purely as the victim. While this strategy can be effective, it's important to use it with care. Toxic INFJs can be very defensive when they feel criticized, and pointing out contradictions in a harsh or accusatory way can backfire. They might feel attacked and become even more manipulative or emotionally volatile. Also, be prepared for deflection. Toxic individuals often have a knack for twisting situations or denying their own contradictions. If they attempt to do this, calmly stick to the facts without getting drawn into an emotional argument. Finally, it's essential to recognize that while highlighting contradictions can help expose toxic behavior, it may not always lead to lasting change. Some toxic INFJs may double down on their manipulation, using their contradictions as a way to further gaslight or confuse you. In such cases, it may be necessary to set firmer boundaries or even distance yourself from the relationship. Highlighting contradictions is a powerful psychological trick that can help toxic INFJs confront their own inconsistencies and manipulative behaviors. By calmly and neutrally pointing out when their words don't match their actions, you can encourage them to reflect on their behavior and create the potential for change. However, it's important to approach this strategy with care, as toxic individuals may react defensively if they feel attacked. If done correctly, though, highlighting contradictions can help disrupt their manipulation and encourage a more authentic and honest interaction. Sometimes, toxic INFJs don't fully realize the damage they're causing until they face real consequences. Whether it's distancing yourself or removing certain privileges they've had in your relationship, allowing them to feel the repercussions of their behavior can be a wake-up call. Psychological trick: withdraw your emotional support or access to privileges they've taken for granted. When they see the consequences of their actions, it might force them to reconsider their behavior. INFJs, even when toxic, often pride themselves on being people of integrity and moral values. By appealing to this aspect of their personality, you can challenge them to live up to the standards they claim to have. Psychological trick: frame your concerns around the concept of integrity. Use phrases like, "I know you value honesty and kindness, but your actions here don't reflect that." This can force them to align their behavior with their values. INFJs need time for self-reflection, especially when they're being toxic. Instead of engaging with them when they're in an unhealthy emotional state, give them space to think and process their actions. INFJs often come around once they've had time to reflect on their behavior alone. Psychological trick: don't engage immediately after a toxic interaction. Step back and give them time to reflect. Many INFJs will eventually realize their mistakes during this period and come back with a more balanced approach. Toxic INFJs can be challenging to deal with, especially since they can turn their powerful empathy and intuition into tools for manipulation. However, by using psychological strategies to create boundaries, manage your emotional responses, and encourage self-reflection, you can disarm their toxicity and guide them toward healthier behavior. In any relationship with a toxic person, it's essential to protect your well-being first and foremost. If their toxic behavior continues despite your efforts, it may be necessary to distance yourself or seek professional support. Ultimately, confronting toxicity requires patience and emotional intelligence, both of which are skills INFJs, when in a healthy state, truly appreciate and respect.